44 years ago, a schoolteacher named Margaret Callahan walked out of Millbrook Elementary in Harmon County, Ohio. Carrying a stack of spelling tests she planned to grade after dinner, and never made it home. Authorities at the time concluded she had likely been the victim of a transient, someone passing through, long gone, untraceable. Her husband, Thomas, a sheet metal worker who had kissed her goodbye at 7:15 that morning before the sun was fully up, knew they were wrong. He knew it from the first night the house stayed dark, and the children kept asking where their mother was, and he never stopped knowing it for the 4 decades that followed. Then, in the spring of 2024, a detective in the Harmon County Cold Case Unit submitted a single piece of evidence: a cigarette stub collected beside Margaret's Pontiac on the night she vanished, to a forensic genealogy lab in Phoenix, Arizona. The technology had not existed when Margaret died. The man who killed her had never imagined that the habit of lighting a cigarette while he waited could outlast his freedom by almost half a century. He was wrong about that too. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to September of 1982. Because to understand what was taken from this family, you first have to understand who Margaret Callahan was. September in Harmon County, Ohio had the particular warmth that small industrial towns always held past its season. The kind that made people feel like the hard part of the year was still a long way off. The maples along Center Street had just started to turn orange at the edges, and there was still enough heat in the afternoons that children left their jackets on coat hooks at school and forgot them there for days. The county seat of Millbrook, population 9,400, sat along the gentle curve of the Heron River, a town of front porches and church potlucks and Friday night football games that filled the bleachers better than most professional stadiums, and half the county showed up for. Margaret Callahan had grown up 3 blocks from Millbrook Elementary, which meant that when she stood in front of her 3rd grade classroom, she was standing in the same building where she had learned to read herself, sitting in a desk that might well have been the same one. She was 34 years old and had taught 3rd grade for 11 years, long enough to have started teaching the younger siblings of her first students. She drove a brown Pontiac Bonneville with 94,000 miles on it that refused to start on cold mornings, kept a thermos of coffee in the cup holder that she refilled every day without ever washing it out, which her husband Thomas found mildly alarming, and wrote comments on her students' papers that were sometimes longer than the papers themselves. She and Thomas had been married 9 years. They had 2 children, Danny, who was 7, and Claire, who was 5. On Saturday mornings, Margaret made pancakes shaped like animals, bears and horses, and occasionally something that Danny insisted was a dinosaur, with blueberries pressed in for eyes. Danny kept a hand-drawn logbook of every creature she'd ever produced. It was 43 entries long by that autumn of 1982. The town knew her the way small towns know their teachers, with the particular warmth people reserve for someone who has seen their children frightened and proud and struggling, all in the same room, and who treated each of those things as equally worthy of attention. She drove the same streets every morning. She ate at the same counter at Dempsey's Diner on Tuesdays. She waved from car windows at people she had known her entire life. On the morning of September 17, 1982, she kissed Thomas on the cheek at 7:15 a.m., told him she'd be home by 6, and asked him to have the kitchen table cleared because she was bringing tests home to grade and needed the space. She never came back to grade them. School had let out at 3:10 p.m. Margaret walked out with the last of her students, crossed the parking lot to her Pontiac, and set her bag in the back seat. A colleague named Helen Voss, who taught 4th grade in the room next door, called out that she'd see her tomorrow and watched Margaret wave back through the car window. That was the last time anyone connected to Millbrook Elementary saw her. By 4 p.m., she had not appeared at Dempsey's Diner, where she occasionally stopped on Tuesdays if Thomas was working late. The waitress there, a woman named Joyce who had known Margaret since high school, noticed only because Margaret had mentioned she might stop in. By 5:45 p.m., Thomas was watching the door. By 6:30, he called Helen Voss. By 7:15, he called the police. At 9:22 p.m., a deputy with the Harmon County Sheriff's Office located Margaret's Pontiac Bonneville, parked on the shoulder of Old Quarry Road, a 2-lane stretch of county highway that cut through mostly farmland about 3 miles east of town. The car was unlocked. Her bag was still in the back seat. Her thermos sat on the passenger seat. The engine was cold. Scattered across the asphalt near the driver's side door were 9 of the spelling tests she had been planning to grade. They were face down, some of them wet from the dew that had settled after dark. Margaret was gone. Search teams canvassed through the night and went out again at first light on the 18th, covering the woods along Old Quarry Road, the farmland on both sides, and the drainage ditches that ran beneath the highway. On the morning of September 20th, 3 days into the search, a deputy working a grid pattern on the eastern side of the road found Margaret Callahan's body in a stand of scrub brush 200 yards from her car. The manner of death was determined to be strangulation. Evidence indicated she had been killed very close to where her car had stopped. Near the driver's door, investigators collected physical evidence: a partial boot print in the soft shoulder of the road, a strip of torn dark blue fabric caught on a fence post 20 feet from the Pontiac, and a single cigarette stub, hand-rolled, found in the gravel just beyond the driver's door. It was bagged and logged. Evidence item number 7 in case file 820917-MC. No one knew yet what that cigarette would mean. The initial theory that Margaret had pulled over for a mechanical problem and been attacked by someone passing through was presented to the family within the first week. Thomas Callahan listened to it and said, quietly, that he didn't believe Margaret would have pulled over on Old Quarry Road for any reason. She knew that road. She wouldn't have stopped there alone after dark. Nobody wrote that down. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Ronald Sykes of the Harmon County Sheriff's Office, a 20-year veteran who had worked most of the serious crimes in the county during his career. He was methodical, and he cared about the Callahan case. He ran the evidence through every available channel. The boot print produced no useful match. The torn fabric was sent to the state lab and returned without an identification. The cigarette stub was examined by the county's forensic team and found to contain biological material. The technology of 1982 was not capable of profiling it. The stub was sealed and placed in the evidence locker. In the first 2 weeks, Sykes identified and interviewed 24 individuals who had recent contact with Margaret. He paid particular attention to a 41-year-old farmhand named Gary Dills, who had reportedly been involved in a property dispute with a neighbor of the Callahans that fall. The connection was thin, resting mostly on that argument and the fact that Dills had no alibi for the evening of the 17th. Sykes pursued him for 3 months before the case against him collapsed entirely when Dills produced a gas station receipt from Youngstown, placing him 2 hours away that evening. While the investigation stalled, Thomas Callahan was conducting his own. He drove every route Margaret might have taken. He talked to every person who used Old Quarry Road regularly. He filled a yellow legal pad with notes, page after page, in the neat compressed handwriting of a man trying to put something unbearable into a shape he could manage. Danny and Claire spent the fall of 1982 at their maternal grandmother's house on weekdays so Thomas could work and meet with investigators. At school, Danny's teacher sent a note home saying he had stopped raising his hand in class. Claire had started having nightmares. By December of 1982, Sykes had run out of leads he could actively pursue. The case remained open, but without new evidence there was nothing to move on. He told Thomas this directly and honestly, which Thomas later said he appreciated, even though the words were the worst he had ever been told. "We're not closing this," Sykes said. "But I need something to work with." Nothing new came. By the spring of 1983, the investigation had gone cold. The Harmon County Sheriff's Office filed the case in the Cold Case Archive. The evidence, the boot impressions, the fabric, the hand-rolled cigarette stub, went into the evidence locker on the 3rd floor of the county building on Main Street, where it would sit for the next 3 decades alongside the other cases the county hadn't been able to close. Thomas Callahan went back to work at the sheet metal shop. He raised Danny and Claire on his own. He never moved out of the house on Maple Drive. By 1990, 8 years had passed. Danny was 15 and could drive the truck. Claire was 13 and played clarinet in the school band. Thomas worked the day shift and cooked dinner every night, and on September 17th of each year, he placed a single yellow rose, Margaret's favorite, on the kitchen table where she had meant to grade those tests. He didn't explain it to the children. They understood without being told. By 1997, 15 years after Margaret's death, Harmon County had changed around the absence of her. The sheet metal shop had laid off 1/3 of its workforce. Dempsey's Diner had changed ownership twice and lost the corner counter where Margaret used to sit. The house next door, where Helen Voss had once lived and waved through a kitchen window at the last person to see Margaret alive, had been sold to a family who knew nothing about a teacher who used to wave from car windows. Danny married in 1998. Claire finished nursing school in 2001. Thomas attended both events and danced with his daughter at her reception the way fathers do when they have been practicing that particular grief for years. Detective Sykes retired from the sheriff's office in 2004. Before he packed up his desk, he wrote a memo requesting that the Callahan case evidence be preserved and flagged for future review as forensic technology advanced. He listed evidence item 7, the cigarette stub, by name. He had never stopped thinking about it. By 2010, 28 years after Margaret's death, the reward poster Thomas had funded and posted in the window of Dempsey's Diner had faded to almost nothing. The new owner offered to take it down and print a fresh one. Thomas told her to leave it. Something about the fading felt honest. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together the lives of people who deserved better. If you want us to keep finding the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Margaret. In 2018, the Harmon County Sheriff's Office assigned a cold case detective named Shorin Mabry to review a backlog of unsolved cases, including the Callahan file. Mabry was 38 years old, a former crime scene investigator who had transferred to the detective division 6 years earlier. She had a reputation for patience. She had worked cold cases before Harmon County and understood something about them that not every detective does. The evidence that mattered was usually already in the room. You just needed the right question. When she pulled evidence item 7 from the Callahan file, the cigarette stub had been in that locker for 36 years. Then, in the spring of 2024, something shifted that no one had anticipated. Detective Mabry had been watching the field of forensic genealogy develop since 2018, when investigators used it to identify Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, after decades of failure by every other means. The process works by uploading biological material from a crime scene to public ancestry databases, then using the resulting matches, sometimes distant cousins twice removed, to build a family tree backward to a common ancestor, and then forward again toward the original contributor. In plain terms, a stranger's family tree becomes a map to an unknown killer. It had solved dozens of cold cases that had no other path to resolution. In March of 2024, Mowbray submitted Evidence Item 7 to a private forensic genealogy firm contracted by the state of Ohio. The hand-rolled cigarette stub had been sealed properly since 1982. The DNA, protected from oxygen and light inside an evidence bag in a county building, had survived. On a Tuesday morning in April of 2024, Mowbray was at her desk reviewing a different case file when her phone rang. She let it go to voicemail. Then, for a reason she later could not articulate, she picked it up before the message finished recording. It was the lab in Phoenix. The DNA had matched. Not a direct hit, a second cousin. A 27-year-old woman in Columbus, Ohio, who had uploaded her genetic data to an ancestry platform 3 years earlier, simply to learn more about her family history. She had no idea her profile would one day connect her to a murder in a county she had never visited. Mowbray and a genealogy specialist spent 6 weeks building out the family tree from that match, tracing siblings and half-siblings, parents and grandparents, branches of the tree that had spread across Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia across 3 generations. One branch led to a man named Robert Weston. Weston was 82 years old. He had lived in Harmon County his entire life. He had worked as a home appliance repairman for 31 years before retiring in 1998. He lived 15 minutes from Old Quarry Road. He had repaired the Callahan's washing machine in August of 1982. Mowbray pulled Sykes's original interview logs from 1982. Weston's name was there, briefly interviewed in the first week as part of a routine canvass of people with recent contact with the victim. The note beside his name read, "No information. No vehicle matching description." Cooperative, released, she set the file down on her desk and sat very still. Then she picked up the phone and called Thomas Callahan. He answered on the second ring. In the autumn of 1982, Robert Weston had been 40 years old and widely regarded as one of the more dependable men on the west side of Harmon County. He drove a white service van with his name on the side. He fixed washing machines and dryers and furnace units for families up and down the county roads, and people let him in with the particular ease that small towns extend to tradesmen who have been around long enough to become part of the landscape. He was married. He attended church. He kept his yard clean. He had access to the Callahan home. He knew Margaret by name. He had been inside their house. Court documents filed in 2024 show that investigators executed a search warrant for Weston's property on June 14th and obtained a DNA sample through a discarded cup at a pharmacy where he had gone to pick up a prescription. A technique investigators use precisely because it requires no cooperation from the subject. The sample was sent to the state crime lab in Columbus. The result came back on June 28, 2024. The DNA on the cigarette stub matched Robert Weston. The cigarette stub that had been sitting in a cardboard evidence box in a county building on Main Street in Millbrook for 42 years. Weston was arrested on July 11, 2024, at his home on Birch County Road. He answered the door himself. According to the arresting officer's report, Weston looked at Detective Mowbray for a long moment, then looked at the ground and said quietly, "I figured this would come." He did not resist. He was placed in handcuffs and walked to the patrol vehicle without another word. The news moved through Harmon County the way news moves through small towns, fast, in all directions simultaneously, by phone and diner table and parking lot conversation. The reaction was not only shock. It was that specific, nauseating recognition that this man had lived among them. He had fixed their appliances. He had sat in their kitchens. He had been trusted the way people are trusted when they've been present long enough to seem permanent. His name had been in a case file since 1982, written on a page that said cooperative and released. And for 42 years that had been enough. Thomas Callahan was 78 years old when he received the call. His son Danny drove 2 hours from Akron when he heard. His daughter Claire was already on the way. In February of 2025, Robert Weston pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Margaret Callahan. His attorney cited his age and deteriorating health. The court sentenced him to 20 years, the maximum applicable under the sentencing guidelines that governed crimes committed in 1982. He will likely die in custody. At the sentencing hearing, Thomas Callahan was permitted to read a statement into the record. He stood at the lectern, a man in his late 70s with his children on either side of him, and spoke for 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. Margaret Callahan was 34 years old. She had a thermos she never washed, and a Pontiac that refused to start in the cold, and a husband who thought the world of her, and 2 children who kept a logbook of animal pancakes. She had a 3rd-grade classroom where she had taught for 11 years, and a Tuesday habit at the corner counter at Dempsey's, and a whole lifetime that belonged to her by right. It was taken from her on a county road on an ordinary September evening, while she was on her way home to clear the kitchen table. Her son Danny is now 49. Her daughter Claire is 47. They grew up without the person who pressed blueberries into batter on Saturday mornings, without a mother who wrote more on their papers than they wrote themselves, without someone who had never once given them a reason to doubt she was coming home. That loss is not recoverable. The guilty plea does not recover it. What it does is give it a name. Thomas Callahan placed his statement into the court record and drove back to the house on Maple Drive with his children. He still lives there. He placed a yellow rose on the kitchen table that night, the way he has every September 17th for 44 years. Justice in this country is imperfect and slow, and sometimes it arrives so late that the people who most needed it are no longer here to receive it. But Margaret Callahan's case carries something that deserves to be named plainly. A retired detective who would never see his own case resolved wrote a memo that preserved the one piece of evidence capable of solving it. A woman in Columbus uploaded her DNA to a genealogy website out of ordinary curiosity and inadvertently connected herself to a murder 4 decades old. A hand-rolled cigarette stub survived 42 years in a cardboard box and held, intact, the biological truth of what had happened on Old Quarry Road. Some things refuse to disappear, even when the people responsible for them are counting on exactly that. What do you think this case says about the future of forensic genealogy? Does it change how you feel about cold case evidence collected before modern DNA technology existed? How do you weigh the sentence Robert Weston received, given that he faces guidelines from 1982 and will likely die in custody? And for those of you who follow cold cases closely, was there a detail in this investigation that surprised you most? Justice came for Margaret Callahan after 44 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.